Stanford University.
Good evening. My name is Abbas Milani. I'm the Muqaddam Director of the Iranian Studies program here at Stanford University. This is the first of our yearly program. We are going to have about 20 programs this year. This is a very auspicious beginning to that, and it's not by accident. We wanted to have our best talk first to entice your appetite to come back for more. These events are made possible by generous gifts from the Darya Bari Endowment for Persian Letters and the Muqaddam program in Iranian Studies. Our events, of course, are not possible without the tireless work of Ms. Sherpa, who's not here right now, but she usually is here, and Tatiana, who designs these beautiful posters. She has an incredible knack for combining image and words to create these posters that are, for me, a pleasure to watch. Before introducing our tonight's speaker, let me briefly tell you about our next event. It is on November 12th. It will be in the Kaberli Auditorium, and it will be the occasion for giving the second Beta Prize for literature and freedom. The winner of this year's award, this new winner, is Goli Taraqi. Her prose is elegant and supple. Her stories are searing in their honesty, but there is also a quality to her lectures that make them, in themselves, a work of art. She has a biting sense of humor, and her talk is My Two Worlds, titled My Two Worlds. And if you have never seen her give a talk, even if you have read her work, I strongly urge you to come. It is truly a wonderful experience. I already told you that if you're not on our mailing list, there is a sheet out there, and if you add your name, we will send you information. I'm also very happy to announce that through generous donations from the Flora Family Foundation and the Hariri family, we are going to be able to offer a 6-month fellowship to Mohsen Namju. He'll be arriving in October 14th. He'll be here for 6 months. He'll give some talks. He'll have some performances. For the first 3 months, he will be a humanities fellow, and then he will be an artist in residence for the music department for the latter part. If you are on our list, we will, of course, send you announcements about both his talk or talks and his performance. Now, to our speaker. Those of us who have the privilege and the pleasure of knowing Dr. Farhad Daftary know that it is incredibly hard to get him to travel to a place as far away as Stanford. Suffice it to say that today's event is the culmination of almost 4 years of my incessant asking, occasional begging, sometimes beseeching, and finally getting him to say yes under duress. It is, I think, far from hyperbole to also say that there is no scholar in the world who has done more to help us understand the intricacies of the Ismaili ideology and theology, the contours of its rich history, than Farhad Daftary. In dozens of books, many of them translated in several languages, and more than 100 scholarly articles, he has mapped out the early development, the sectarian evolution, the philosophical underpinnings, and the historical progress of the Ismaili faith, and how it manifests itself in the Western consciousness. His truly impressive erudition, his impeccable and exhaustive methodology, his legendary patience in searching archives and collections for the smallest details of Ismaili history, and finally his supple and parsimonious prose, free from the temptation of jargonist exhibitionism, a malady common to the works of scholarship, combined to give his impressive body of work their unique place in Islamic historiography. He was trained as an economist, receiving a PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. And in what I think was a most fortuitous turn of event for Islamic and Ismaili historiography, he forfeited the riches of a career in economics for the emotional riches of a life of monastic dedication to scholarship. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Farhad Daftary and his lovely wife who has traveled with him from London, Mrs. Daftary. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Well, thank you very much, Professor Milani, for those very kind words. I'm delighted to be here tonight with you and so open this new series of lectures of this auspicious Center of Iranian Studies here. The subject matter for my talk is, you see, rather complex, as you can imagine, but I shall try to give you some a survey in a sense, but really snippets and highlights within a survey which can, I hope, be connected together in a more or less coherent fashion. The Ismailis, as you know, actually represent a major branch of Shia Islam, and they have had a very long, complex and complicated history, which really dates back to the middle of the 8th century. On 2 occasions, they succeeded in founding states, initially at the Fatimid Caliphate, based mostly in Egypt, which was ruled by a series of Ismaili imams. And secondly, the Principality of Alamut in northern Iran, with a branch in Syria. The Iranians have also made very significant contributions to Ismaili intellectual development, and they also played key roles at various times in Ismaili history. Today, the Ismailis are comprised of some 15 millions who are scattered in more than 25 countries of the world, in Asia, Africa, as well as the various parts of the Middle East, Europe, and North America. And so members of the main branch of Ismailism actually have always had a line of present imams, which today is represented by the 49th imam, who is known to the world as His Highness the Aga Khan. One main feature of Ismaili history, or more specifically historiography, has been the fact that for the most part the Ismailis have been perceived, studied, and evaluated almost exclusively until more recent times on the basis of evidence collected or often even fabricated by their adversaries. As a result, they came to be misrepresented, with a whole series of myths and legends circulating about them both in the West as well as in the Muslim world. So to provide an appropriate context for our talk, it will be useful to spend a few minutes to see how this picture, how the perception of the Ismailis actually sort of developed over time, and why did they receive such negative press, so to speak, within within the Muslim world, it's dominated by the Sunni Muslims. The Shia, as you may know, the Shia Muslims from the beginning believed that the Prophet Muhammad had actually appointed his successor under divine command, and that successor was his cousin and son-in-law Ali. And that therefore the leadership of the Ummah or the Muslim community by divine command should have been handed to Ali, and then after Ali amongst his descendants, the so-called Alid Imams. But in actuality, things, did not work out that way. And the Shia, therefore, organized to voice their protest against what had actually occurred. And in the course of time, the Shi'i Muslims themselves became subdivided into a number of groups. Eventually, only 3 or 4 of such groups survived. But in the 8th century, especially after the success of the Abbasid revolution, which culminated in the coming to power of the Abbasids in the year 749, 750, the bulk of the Shia by that time had recognized a line of Alid Imams descended from Ali ibn Abi Talib, and by that time the Imam of the time was Ja'far as-Sadiq, who actually succeeded in the course of his imamat to consolidate Shi'ism on a quiescent basis. And this tradition was maintained by the so-called 12 Shia, who were to appear subsequently. But from early on, the Ismailis, who themselves compromised, who actually came to represent one of the branches of the Imami Shia, they in fact represented the activist branch, the revolutionary branch. They were not happy with the state of affairs as they had developed, and they aimed to organize a revolutionary movement, the overall aim of which was to install their Imam to rule to the actual leadership of the Muslim community. And it was in the service of this aim that the Ismailis or missionaries or Da'is operated in almost every Islamic land, from North Africa all the way to Central Asia and in various parts of Iran. By the year 909, the early success of the Ismailis actually it culminated in the foundation of the Fatimid Caliphate under the leadership of the Ismaili Imam of the time. And that meant that henceforth the potential challenge to the established Sunni order had now become actualized. And it was from that time that the Abbasid Sunni establishment, or the regime, the ruling sort of regime, they embarked on a well-orchestrated, organized I would say literary campaign against the Ismailis. And the overall aim of this campaign was to defame the Ismailis and to represent the Ismailis as the arch enemy of Islam, whose aim was to actually destroy Islam from within. And in order to support these allegations, a number of Sunni polemicists, they began to write texts in which all sorts of heretical teachings and practices were attributed to the Ismailis. And these books, these texts, actually did circulate widely, and over time they came to be accepted as reliable and accurate descriptions of Ismaili teachings, beliefs, and practices. And they became source materials for a variety of Muslim authors, theologians, jurists, hagiographiers, anybody who wanted to write anything about the Ismailis would use these anti-Ismaili polemical sources as reliable source material. And it was in these sources that a 7-stage of initiation was attributed to the Ismailis, with the ultimate stage or phase of atheism. And of course, they also denied the Alid genealogy of the Ismaili Imams. And later on, when in Iran, a new branch of Ismailism was founded under the initial leadership of Hassan Sabbah. The Ismailis of the Iranian lands were now began to be targeted for a new wave of sort of literary attacks initiated by the foremost Sunni scholar author of the time, Al-Ghazali. This, more or less, this situation, this state of affairs, continued unchanged until, I would say, late to the 19th century. Now, meanwhile, the Crusaders, the medieval Europeans, had come into contact with the Syrian branch of the Ismailis in the context of their sort of campaigns to liberate Jerusalem. The Crusaders, when they arrived in the Near East, they were completely ignorant of Islam and its internal divisions as a religion. They stayed in the Near East for almost 200 years. They founded 4 states, and they had numerous interactions and channels of communications with Muslims. But proximity to the Muslims did not improve the knowledge of the Crusaders and medieval Europe of things Islamic. And, for instance, as one example of the sort of ignorance which continued to be manifested, we have the case of William of Tyre, who was one of the most learned sort of historians of the Crusades. He had spent more than 20 years in the Holy Land, and in his book, he says that after years of traveling and discussion with Muslims, he had finally come to understand the points or the main point of difference between the Shia and the Sunnis, and he sums up the situation as thus. He says, the message of Islam was originally intended for Ali, but the Archangel Jibreel, he became confused regarding the address, and he gave the message to Muhammad, and hence the reason for the difference between these two communities, and so on, so forth. Now, the same people who had remained so ignorant of Islam now began to claim to have found secret information about the secret practices of the Ismailis of Syria. And this really provided the background for the so-called assassin legends. These were the tales, I would say, which were fabricated by the Crusaders and their Western chroniclers, just regarding again the secret practices of the Ismailis, which found their culmination in the synthesis proposed by Marco Polo in the form of the sacred garden of the paradise, in which the young Ismailis were led and where they sort of were permitted to enjoy 4 tastes of the paradise, and then they were given hashish or some such intoxicating potion, and they were taken out of this secret garden, and then they were sent on senseless murder missions by their mischievous leader, the old man of the mountain. Now, what's actually interesting from our perspective is that these tales, again, like their counterpart in the Sunni world, were actually accepted by generations of Europeans, again, as accurate descriptions of secret practices of the Ismailis, and they came down as such. And in the 19th century, when scientific Orientalism began on the basis of the availability of Islamic manuscripts, the Orientalists too, unwillingly or perhaps unknowingly, were obliged to lend their seal of support to these to both of these categories of misrepresentations: the anti-Ismaili polemics of the Sunni writers and the assassin legends of the medieval crusaders, because whatever they had to say was based on these 2 categories of sources. It was a bit later that things began to change drastically, and the change was brought about by the recovery and study of a large number of genuine Ismaili texts for the first time. These texts had been preserved secretly in a large number of private collections in Yemen, Syria, Iran, Central Asia, and India, and they began to be made available to scholars, especially in India, where the Ismaili Society of Bombay was, founded with a major, library. And as a result of this new scholarship, a completely new, I would say, image began to emerge in connection with Ismaili history and teachings. And this new picture, which is still ongoing now, has proven to be as amazing as the sort of legends which had been circulating before. This new image shows the richness and the diversity of the intellectual traditions elaborated by the Ismailis, the rich sort of heritage that was produced by the Ismailis at various times in their history, mostly in Arabic, but in the Iranian lands, also in Farsi, because from the beginning, Hassan Sabbah, as we shall see, chose Persian in preference to Arabic as the religious language of the Ismaili community of the Persian-speaking lands. And it's also in that context that one can appreciate the work that is currently being done by the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, where the largest collection of such manuscripts has been preserved, and they have been catalogued, and they are made accessible to scholars worldwide. Now, it's on the basis of this modern scholarship in Ismaili studies that we have now a much better understanding of the various phases in Ismaili history and the contributions made by various groups, including especially the Iranians. Now, in this second part of my talk, I shall try to give you an overview of the parts that relate to the Iranian lands. It was on the death of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, as I mentioned, in the year 765, that the Imami Shia, who were the most important Shi'i group at the time, were split into various groups, two of which can be identified with the earliest Ismailis. Now, the objective of these early Ismaili groups, as noted, was to install their Imam to the actual sort of leadership of the entire Muslim community. And the Da'is of the community, they carried this message throughout the Islamic world, beginning with southern Iraq and Iran. In fact, the Ismailis of that region and also other parts of the Iranian world have had the longest continued history compared to all the other Ismaili communities, especially followed by those in Yemen and Syria. One of the early Imams, who was a grandson of Imam as-Sadiq by the name of Muhammad, he emigrated from the Hejaz, which was the seat of the Ali family, spent some time in Basra, and then moved on to Khuzestan, the southwestern province of Iran, where he spent to the latter part of his life. And it was from there that he remained in contact with the bulk of the Ismailis, who, like other early Shia, were based in Kufa. It was again from Khuzestan, that specifically the city of Ahvaz, that one of the earliest Da'is by the name of Hussein Ahwazi was sent to Iraq, where he converted Hamdan Qarmat, a very well-known early Ismaili figure, and his brother-in-law Abdan. Abdan himself came from Khuzestan. And Abdan, in turn, he converted a number of people and educated a number of Da'is, including Abu Sa'id Jannabi from the port of Ganava in Fars, who later became the founder of the Qarmati state of Bahrain in the year 899. But it was mainly after the middle of the 9th century that the Ismaili Da'is, almost as if suddenly, began to appear in various regions, especially in various parts of a region in Iran, so referred to as the Jebal by the Arabs. This actually covered the central and west central parts of Iran, and it included the cities of Qom, Kashan, and Hamadan, and so on. Da'is were active from that early period in these regions. But by contrast to the Da'is active in Iraq and later in Yemen, where they addressed their message to large numbers because they wanted to organize a revolutionary movement, the same strategy was initially attempted in Iran. It failed. And therefore, in the Iranian lands from early on, they adopted a new strategy, and that was to address the elite and the most educated strata of the society. We see this very clearly in the work of the 5th chief Da'i of Ray, or the Jebal, Da'i Abu Hatem al-Razi, who actually managed to convert the governor of the city of Ray, as well as a number of rulers from the dynasties of the Justanites and others. And a bit, you see later, we see the same policy manifested through the efforts of Dai Muhammad al-Nasafi, who was active in Central Asia and managed to penetrate the inner circles of the Samanid court and finally managed to convert the Samanid Amir himself, Amir Nasr II, as well as his Wazir and a number of courtiers. It was under such circumstances that in the year 909, the Ismaili, they succeeded in founding, through the efforts of one such Dai in the region then known as Afriqiya, which actually covers what today is known as Tunisia and part of eastern Algeria, the Fatimid Caliphate, under the leadership of the Ismaili Imam of the time, Abdullah al-Mahdi. Now this signified not only a major success for the Ismailis, who now saw their own Imam installed to the leadership in a major Islamic state, but it was really a success also for the Shia in general, because not since the time of Ali himself had the Alid Imams had the chance of sort of ruling over a major state. This state very soon grew into a major empire, stretching all the way from, you see, Morocco to the Hejaz, Palestine, and Syria. And a bit later, the seat of this state or empire was moved to Egypt, where the Fatimids, who were at the same time the Ismaili Imams, founded the city of Cairo, which served as a major, you see, center of learning, arts and sciences and commerce in the Islamic world. While these events were occurring in the western part of the Islamic world, in the east, in the Iranian lands, the Da'is had continued to be active even after the foundation of the Fatimid state, because the Fatimids never gave up their universalist aim of extending their rule over the entire Islamic society and beyond. In the Iranian lands, especially since from earlier on the policy was to address the message of the mission to the elite and the educated classes of the society, the Da'is actually elaborated a new intellectual tradition, which has become referred to as philosophical theology. This was the first, in that context, the Ismailis of the Iranian lands were the first Shi'i community to have elaborated this distinct tradition of philosophical theology. Now, what did this mean? The Iranian Da'is of these lands, starting with Abu Yaqub Sejistani and then Hamid-ed-Din Kermani, and finally, last but not least, was Nasser Khosrow, who was very active in the region of Badakhshan. They amalgamated their Ismaili theology with Neoplatonism and a variety of other Hellenistic philosophical traditions. Why? Because they were addressing their message again to the most educated layers of society, and they wanted to maximize the intellectual appeal of their message. And philosophy was the thing in the eastern regions, in the region of Khorasan. So for that reason, they used the most up-to-date, the most then fashionable idioms and themes to enhance, to increase, to enhance the intellectual appeal of their message without compromising their own theology, which was founded on the doctrine of imamat, which had continued to be the central teaching of the Ismailis, like other Shi'i communities. And that, in a nutshell, which was also combined with the distinctive cyclical view of history propounded by the Ismailis, who saw history as a progression of various cycles or eras, each one initiated by a prophet who brought a new sort of message, followed by a number of imams. Now, in each era, and this, of course, combined with a basic religious system of thought of the Ismailis, which made a fundamental distinction between the Zahir and the Batin, or the sort of letter of the scriptures and their spirituality or esoteric meaning and essence. So in each era, the authorized guides were the only ones who had access, who had full knowledge of both the apparent and the hidden. And it was by acknowledging the leadership and the authority of these guides in each era that you could have, that one could be guaranteed salvation. So you had to acknowledge the rightful imam of the time. This was really the essence of the message, which was garbed in that elegant, very complex, so metaphysical system propounded by the da'is of the Iranian lands. The Ismaili Da'wat or mission had its longest and sort of most successful achievement outside of the domains of the Fatimid state. Oddly enough, within the Fatimid state, where Ismailism was the law of the land and Ismailis received the protection of the state, the Ismailis continue to be a minority. But outside of the Fatimid state, it was there that the Ismailis did achieve their long-lasting success, especially in the Iranian lands. And this activity actually continued even after the Sunni Seljuks had replaced the Shi'i Buyids, who were the real overlords of the Sunni Abbasids who ruled from Baghdad. It was, for instance, at that time that we have one of the most learned Ismaili da'is. These da'is were, of course, at the same time the scholars and authors of the community. Da'i al-Ma'id Fiddin Shirazi, who was from Shiraz, and there he had actually managed to convert the Buyid ruler of Fars, Abu Khalija, and then was obliged to flee to Egypt, where he became the chief da'i, a post he held for almost 20 years until he died in 1078. And another sort of very highly learned da'i of the time was, as I mentioned, Nasir Khusro, was born in the year 1004. He converted to Ismailism at a later age, went to Cairo to further his Ismaili education, and went back to Badakhshan, his native region, to propagate Ismailism there. Like most other da'is, was persecuted by the local Sunni authorities and was obliged to seek exile in the remote valley of Yomgan. And there he, from the midst of the Pamir mountains, he became quite successful in spreading the message of Ismailism. And that is the reason why the Ismaili communities of those mountainous regions today, situated in Tajikistan, Afghanistan, the northern areas of Pakistan, and a corner of China, they do regard him as the founder of their communities, and he's held in very high esteem. By the 1050s, the Seljuks had established their rule. In fact, the Turks, it was the era of the Turks over the Iranian lands in succession to Arabs. By that time, there was one chief, Dai, who had his secret headquarters near the city of Isfahan, which was one of the main Seljuk capitals. The chief Dai of the time was somebody by the name of Abdul Malik ibn Attash, was a very sort of learned Dai, but his importance in history is that he recognized the talents of a then newly convert Hassan Sabbah. Hassan Sabbah himself had been born in Qom in the mid-1050s. Soon afterwards, the family had moved to the nearby city of Rey. Both of these sort of cities had served as traditional seats of Shi'i learning. And Rey had always been a stronghold of the activities of Ismaili Dais. And it was there that Hassan, around the age of 17, was converted to Ismailism. And he was brought to the attention of Abdul Malik, who took him to the headquarters of the Dawat in Isfahan. And then on his recommendation, he went to Fatimid Egypt, again to further his Ismaili education, came back to Iran. His experience in Egypt must have helped him shape his own new revolutionary policy, because Hassan Sabbah now begins a completely new phase in the development of Ismailism. He is already charting an independent revolutionary course. And in order to understand this accurately, we must bear in mind that Hassan had a complex set of religio-political motives. As a Shia, he could not tolerate the anti-Shi'i policies of the Sunni Seljuk Turks, who had then newly established their rule over the Iranian lands. But his revolution was also an expression of his, I would say, Iranian national sentiments. Because Persians had continued all along under the Arabs and then the Turks to be conscious and aware of their Persian identity and cultural heritage. And it was perhaps the second factor that explains the early success of Hassan Sabbah's movement in Iran. Not all those who came to his support were Ismaili Shi'is. Many of them were Iranians who detested the alien rule of Seljuks, who also wreaked havoc in the countryside and raised heavy taxes and so on, so forth. So it was to uproot Seljuk rule that Hassan Sabbah organized this revolutionary movement from his headquarters in the fortress of Alamut. And he devised an appropriate strategy which was the right response to the type of organization and rule offered by the Seljuks. I must also add that it was as an expression of his Iranian sentiments that Hassan, for the first time now, adopts Persian language, as I mentioned, in preference to Arabic as the religious language of the Ismailis of the Iranian lands. And this explains why the literature produced by the Ismailis of those regions from that time onwards up until now has been all written in Farsi. Hassan, of course, in response to the decentralized nature of Seljuk rule, aimed to uproot the Seljuks locality by locality and Amir by Amir. And as I said, he designed a strategy that was appropriate to sort of the reality of his struggle. The Seljuks, of course, were much more powerful in sort of military terms. They very easily could mobilize large armies, and these armies were sent from early on. But Hassan actually established himself in the fortress of Alamut in the year 1090, already by 2 years later, 1092, when he had already founded a state within the very heart of the Seljuk state. The Seljuks, under the advice of Nizam al-Mulk, who was the chief vizier to two Seljuk sultans, had sent major expeditions against Alamut. But these expeditions and many more to follow achieved very sort of little. By the time Hassan died in 1124, the Ismailis had actually managed to extend their sway throughout a number of regions within Iran, not only in parts of Deilam, one Alamut, and a number of other fortresses, some 100 such fortresses were situated, but also in the region of Qumes, where near the city of Dameqan, the Ismailis had come to possess a major fortress, the fortress of Gerdku, as well as a region in the southeastern part of Khorasan, and also other sort of lesser areas of Iran. This Ismaili state lasted 166 years. But already by the time of Hassan Sabbah's death in 1124, a sort of stalemate had occurred between the Ismailis of the Iranian lands and the Seljuks. And the Seljuks, in spite of their much superior military power and their campaigns, had failed to dislodge the Ismailis from their fortress communities. This state was ruled by 3 dais and 5 imams. By the year 1256, when the first Mongol invasions occurred, the Ismailis had also extended their patronage of learning to non-Ismailis. We must bear in mind that from the beginning, from the time of Hassan Sabbah himself, the Ismailis also elaborated to their various intellectual traditions and teachings in response to changed circumstances. And Hassan himself had founded a major library in the fortress of Alamut, and later other major Ismaili fortresses in both Syria and Iran had come to possess major collections of manuscripts as well as scientific instruments. And as I said, they actually throughout the course of the Alamut period, especially towards the end, after the initial Mongol invasions, they extended their patronage of learning to many other Muslims, including numerous Muslim scholars, foremost among whom was Khaja Nasiruddin Tusi, a major figure of Shi'i thought, who spent 30 years among the Ismailis in Khorasan and then at Alamut, and this was perhaps the most productive period in the life of Tusi, during which time he made major contributions to almost every field of learning: theology, philosophy, Sufism, Ismaili thought as well, astronomy, and so on. And in fact, he was so impressed by the Ismailis that he willingly converted to Ismailism, as he has explained in his spiritual autobiography, Sayr wa Suluk. A completely new era in Ismaili history, especially in the Iranian lands, began with the Mongol invasions. The Mongols had two objectives. One Holaku led the major Mongol expedition to Iran. The first objective was to destroy the Ismaili state of Iran, which had been founded some 165 years earlier by Hassan Sabbah. And secondly, he was to proceed to Baghdad and to uproot the Abbasid Caliphate. He achieved his first objective with much difficulty. It took him quite a while to finally manage to force the surrender of Alamut, which was really the seat of this state. Large numbers of Ismailis were massacred by the Mongols, especially in the region of Khorasan. Many who had survived the Mongol swords emigrated to adjacent lands where Ismaili communities already existed, especially to Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Sindh. Now, in this new era, once again, the Ismailis were obliged to observe very strictly the taqiyya, or precautionary dissimulation. They had to hide their true religious beliefs. They adopted various disguises, including Sunnism, but they developed special kind of rapport or coalescence with Sufism or Islamic mysticism. It's from this time that we see the use of Sufi concepts, terms like Pir and Murid by the Ismailis. Pir, which was applied to the highest rank in the religious hierarchy of the community, it was also applied to the person of the Imam himself, and Murid was an ordinary Ismaili. Now, during this time, this period which lasted for a few centuries, this Sufi dissimulation was used and practiced without the Ismailis having been affiliated to any of the Sufi orders which were then developing in Iran and Central Asia. Around the middle of 15th century, the Ismaili Imams emerged in the village of Anjudan, not too far from Arak, Qom, and Mahallat in central Iran, initiating what has been referred to as the Anjudan revival in medieval Ismaili history. Until then, various Ismaili communities in Iran, in Badakhshan, in Syria, and in South Asia had developed independently of one another, and for the most part they had also been deprived of the central leadership of their imams, who had gone into hiding after the Mongol invasions. But now the imams emerge in the village of Anjudan and attempt to revive their da'wat activities and send trustworthy dais and agents to these various communities. These activities became particularly successful in Central Asia and South Asia. So the fact that a large Ismaili community exists in various parts of Central Asia, especially in the region of Badakhshan, which today is divided by the Oxus River between Tajikistan and Afghanistan is really due to the success of the activities of the Ismaili Dawah during the Anjudan period, which lasted from around 1450 until about 1700. By the coming of, by the establishment of Safavid rule in 1501 over Iran, to the Safavids who now adopted 12 Shiism as the official religion of the realm, the Ismailis, especially in those sort of regions of the Iranian world, now adopted a second form of disguise, 12 Shiism, which was the politically correct form of Shiism. But a phenomenon which has really not received enough scholarly attention is the long-term practice of taqiyya. What happens when a community pretends to be something else, but for a long time? What happens is that eventually the cover that was originally adopted as a form of precautionary dissimulation becomes, sort of serves to affect the true identity of that community. So what happened, in short, in Iran was that large Ismaili communities did actually integrate into the dominant 12 Shi'i community of the Iranian lands. But not so in Central Asia, where 12 Shiism was never very strong, and also in India, where a variety of religious communities always, they always existed side by side. That was really, in short, a brief sort of overview. Now, by the middle of 18th century, the Ismaili imams of this branch, who had been living in Iran, they emerged into public life and political prominence as governors of various provinces, beginning with the province of Kerman, where the 44th imam, by the name of Sayyid Abul Hasan Kahaki, who died in 1792, was appointed to the governorship of Kerman by Karim Khan Zand, a post that was also held by his grandson Hassan Ali Shah, who received the honorific title of Agha Khan from Fath Ali Shah, a title which has remained amongst his descendants, the modern Nizari Ismaili imams. The first Agha Khan was also appointed to the governorship of Qom and Mahallat by Fath Ali Shah, and then later, in the time of Fath Ali Shah's grandson and successor Muhammad Shah, the first Agha Khan was also appointed to the governorship of the province of Kerman, a post he held for about 2 years, from 1835 to 1837. Then, under some obscure circumstances, which may also have had to do with the ambitions of the chief vizier to the position of the master of one of the Sufi branches, while the first Agha Khan actually he lent his support to the candidacy of another person. Anyway, a series of conflicts broke out between the Ismaili Imam, the 45th, and the Qajar, the Qajar order, the Qajar establishment, it finally deteriorated into the military encounters, and the first Aga Khan was eventually obliged to leave Iran permanently, his ancestral home, in 1840, and went to India, and a few years later he settled down permanently in the city of Bombay, which then ushered in the modern period, the modern era of Ismaili history. So in brief, much of the history of the Ismailis did occur over to the Iranian lands, and the Dais of the Iranian lands played a major role in contributing to the intellectual traditions of the community. And it was really due to the efforts of Hassan Sabbah that Ismailism actually managed to survive outside of the Fatimid state in the Iranian lands, while within the Fatimid state, Ismailism actually disappeared almost completely soon after the fall of the Fatimid Caliphate in the year 1171. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your time and your patience.
We have time for some questions?
Sure, yes. Yes?
Would you say that the manuscripts that have been uncovered are largely in Farsi, and how far back do these manuscripts go?
Manuscripts are in 3 scripts. I mean, there are in 2 scripts and a variety of languages. So in Arabic script, which means either they are in Arabic or Farsi. During the early period and the Fatimid period, all these texts were written in Arabic except for the works of Nasir Khosrow. Nasir Khosrow was the only Da'i author scholar of the Fatimid period who wrote all of his works in Persian. And then, as we saw, from the time of Hassan Sabbah onwards, the Ismailis of the Iranian lands, they produce all of their religious literature again in Persian. And the Arabic texts were obviously preserved by the Arabic-speaking Ismailis, mostly in Syria and Yemen, from where these texts were subsequently transferred to the Indian subcontinent. The bulk of these Arabic manuscripts, I would say, are currently preserved in Syria, Yemen, and South Asia. Whereas in Iran and Central Asia and adjacent parts, Afghanistan and so on, all the manuscripts are in Persian. We have a 3rd script, the Khochki script, which was actually devised by the Nizari Ismaili Khojas of the subcontinent, and they have produced a very rich literature, the so-called Genan literature, which is expressed in Gujarati and several other Indic languages, but mostly written in the Khochki manuscript. At the Institute, we have a large collection also of the Khochki manuscripts. And now most of the Ismaili manuscripts in Arabic and Persian are not very old, but they have this tradition of copying these manuscripts has been ongoing, and they are mostly from 18th, the manuscripts which have come to light are mostly from 18th century and onwards. Very few predate 18th century, but the works that, of course, were written in Fatimid times, it's true that we do not have the original or very old copies, but the tradition of copying these texts was in place, and we do have more sort of, we have subsequent copies of those originals. Yes?
Yes, thank you for the talk. I have a general question, actually two parts to it. The separation that occurred from the seventh Imam onward, did the concept of the Twelver Shi'ism exist even at that time, or did it not exist? And if it did, this separation or schism that occurred, how did the Ismailis justify or rationalize this separation despite their dissatisfaction with the status quo and their motivation to make changes? So that's the first part. And then the second part is a more contemporary question. Given the small numbers of Ismailis that live in even Islamic world, how are they treated, and are they still forced to practice dissimulation?
Yeah. To answer, your first question first. Shiism was extremely, fluid at the beginning. When you look at the heresiographical record of the early Shi'i groups and sects, they list something like more than 70 groups. Many of them just came and went, in a very short period of time. Imami Shi'ism was, of course, a major community, and as I mentioned, on the death of Imam as-Sadiq, who was the sixth Imam, his Shia split into 6 groups. One of the groups eventually became known as the 12er Shia. So obviously at the time of Imam as-Sadiq, there was nothing sacred or known about the figure 12. The figure of 12 was in fact fixed much later on. So it was quite normal for a Shia group to split, and in fact, always one of these groups denied the death of the last Imam, and so expected his return, his imminent return, as the Mahdi. So that Mahdi concept was there from, already from the year 700. In reply to your second question, the Ismailis, of course, live as religious minorities everywhere today, in the world. Where there is, religious, freedom and practice, like in Western countries, they do not need to practice dissimulation. But in some less fortunate, part of the world, let's say in northern areas of Pakistan or in Afghanistan, specifically, in our own time, in some villages, obviously they are obliged to dissimulate.
What about in Iran?
In Iran, they do not dissimulate, but they've had a shifting sort of a situation during the Islamic Revolution. But right now, they are not being persecuted. They are left to, practice, their own faith and within the community. But they are being, of course, very closely watched by the regime. Yes, the gentleman back there.
Thank you for the talk. How conversion from Shiism today in Iran could be viewed if you become an Ismaili today? Do you have any knowledge of that?
What do you mean?
The reason I say that vis-a-vis, someone like Baha'is or converting from Shia Islam to another religion.
No, I see. Well, Baha'ism, of course, is a completely different story. Ismailis are recognized as a bona fide Shia community, even by the existing establishment in Iran. But Ismailis today in the world, they do not attempt to convert. I mean, you see, although you can become an Ismaili, if you like to, the Ismailis themselves, the Ismaili sort of leadership is not seeking an active conversion. I mean, is not following an active conversion policy. They are more interested, I would say, in educating the existing members of the community at various ages rather than sort of bringing new persons on board. That is not a priority for them at all. Yes?
So how do you explain you mentioned the quietism idea of this, anti-quietism ideas of Ismailis from the beginning, which was correct.
That's how it began, yes.
And through Fatimids is very obvious. But one can see now from the Safavid dynasty the opposite. Actually, the history has shown that
yes.
The Ismailis have become more quietist up
yes.
to now,
yes.
and the Twelvers have become the opposite. Actually,
that's a
Jamal
very good point. Very good point. Yes.
Revolutionary.
Yeah.
So how do you explain this switch between the two movements?
Circumstances. Realpolitik. The circumstances of the time. The Safavids, as you know, were the sheikhs of a Sufi order, which was very, militant from the beginning, and they were Sunnis. All of the Safavid sheikhs until Shah Ismail were Sunnis, but upon acceding to the throne, they switched. They fabricated an Ali genealogy for themselves, tracing their descent to Imam Musa Kazim, and they also began to propagate initially a very radical form of Shiism. It was not 12 Shiism at the beginning. It was a very eclectic form of Shiism, which was a mixture of the beliefs of Turkomans, who were the backbone of the Safavid armies. The Mahdi concept was there. Shah Ismail, for a while, actually claimed to be, or wanted to claim to be, the Mahdi. It was gradually. It actually took them, about a century to, calm down and tone down the sort of radicalism of their Shiism, and they fell more in line with what was sort of better known as 12 Shiism. As for the Ismailis, after the fall of Alamut, they lost their political power. They no longer. You cannot be radical without its political power, or without wanting to gain political power. But if you have no political ambition, then you can accept, the status quo and live peacefully. And that's what the Ismailis have done for the most part after losing the political prominence with the fall of Alamut in 1256.
Thank you. You referenced in your discussions 7 stages of philosophy.
7 stages. No, in 2 contexts I spoke of 7. 7 cycles of religious history of mankind, and also in the anti-Ismaili polemics, 7 stages of initiation through which the Da'i took the new convert, which would ultimately take him to the 7th stage of atheism and sort of libertinism, and
So is that still part of the philosophy there?
No. In the genuine Ismaili texts that have come to light, there is no mention of any set sort of number of stages. Pedagogy is always obviously gradual. I mean, you sort of move from the simpler to more complex fields and so on, but you do not really find any sort of reference whatsoever to any sort of fixed number of stages through which so that the education of a new convert would proceed.
So a follow-on question also regarding this state of affairism, the assassination kind of.
Assassination was, as I said, was part of the policy designed by Hassan al-Sabah. He did not invent that. That policy was adhered to by all groups at the time, including the Crusaders, the Seljuks themselves. But since he could not, mobilize large armies to combat the Seljuks, he aimed to remove their key individuals, amirs and so on a sort of regional basis. But of course, that served to provide the basis for a whole sort of a series of myths, because every assassination of any importance in the central Islamic lands at the time was usually attributed to the Ismailis, whereas the actual such missions were really not, that many.
So the concept of emulation.
Emulation.
Yeah.
Taqlid, you mean?
Taqlid. Attributed to one of the main thinkers, Farhad in contemporary studies.
Yes.
Which also is attributed to the decline of the Islamic civilization, so to speak, dating back. What is your...
Well, Khaja Tusi he made, as I sort of very briefly mentioned, in my talk, he made major contributions to the Ismailis thought of the late Alamut period, and then you see after that, after the fall of Alamut, the Khaja was a very clever man. He was always interested in seeking patrons who would enable him to do his work. I mean, and then, it was after the fall of Alamut that he joined the service of Holaku, and with whose help he managed to have that major, observatory in Maraqa, and then he made major contribution to Imami 12 Shi'i thought of the period, as a major contributor. So he had, in both forms of Shi'ism, to both forms of Shi'ism, he made major contributions. But the whole concept of ijtihad and taqlid and so on, that of course that by itself is a very complex issue. You have to look at the development since I would say around the greater occultation of the 12th Imam of the 12th Shia, and how that field sort of developed, and the various schools based in Basra and Baghdad and so on, until it really found its culmination in the usuli and the akhbari and the usuli debate, which raged even down to the 18th century. I cannot cover that here. I mean, one has to really look at the whole range of contributions made by different scholars of 12 Shi'ism, Sheikh Mufid, and
So let me be a little bit more precise.
Yeah.
There is an accusation that up to that point,
up to which point? Up to
the point of Farhad Nasir,
yes.
there is an exchange, a dialogue going within Islam, which is not trying to suppress opposing views. Whereas with Farhad Nasir, starting with Ghazali, but with Farhad Nasir,
Yes. Yeah.
this idea becomes more and more
Limited. Limited. That's true.
that
Ijtihad.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that was.
Yeah, no, that is correct. Yes?
I've got two questions. Number one, you mentioned that the Fatimid leaders themselves did not spread the message within the state they were ruling, but outside.
Let me just preface that by one sort of remark. Shiism had never found before, during, or after the Fatimids any strong footholds in all of North Africa. North Africa traditionally was a stronghold of the Kharijis, where they still exist today, in Algeria and so on, and Sunni Islam, especially of the Maliki form, where in the cities where the Arabs had actually settled. In Egypt itself, the Sunni majority belonged to the Shafi'i mazhab, and there was a very important Coptic community of Christians, as well as important Jewish communities. And you see, all of these communities served under the Fatimids, and in fact, many of them came to hold the most important positions of the state under the Fatimids. But that was not the case outside, because outside of the Fatimid states, especially in the Iranian lands, the Ismailis were operating in regions where Ismailism of the earlier period already had deep roots, in addition to other forms of Shiism. Imami Shiism, Zaydi Shiism in northern Iran. So the ground was more ready for the message of the Ismaili da'is than within the domains of the Fatimid state. That was the reason.
That answers my first question.
You have two questions. Yes.
Can you speak to the ritual of Ashe Bibi Murad, and whether it was a deep-rooted Ismaili ritual or borrowed as part of Taqiyya?
Bibi Murad of
there is a
which region are you? In Khorasan?
Khorasan. It's all female.
Murad, yes. You are talking about a splinter group, Murad Mirzais, who split up from the main Ismaili group at the beginning of the 20th century under the initial leadership of Murad Mirza, and hence they are known as Murad Mirzais. The leadership of the community was handed down amongst his descendants, including his granddaughter, Bibi Talat. They have become almost the same as 12 Shia now. Almost. It's a very small community based at the village of Sede in southern Khorasan. You had one question. Let me give this young gentleman a chance. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about sort of the broader influence of Ismaili intellectual thought on other Muslim groups?
You have to buy some of our publications for that. I cannot give you all of that in one lecture. We have a lot of actually books that deal with precisely with what you are now raising, the broader implications and contributions.
Did the presence of having so much of this thought produced in Persian ever prevent it from affecting sort of the Arabic-speaking?
Of course, language. Yes, language was of course a barrier. I mean, when Hassan Sabbah chose Persian as the language of the community, in a sense, the community, not completely, but in a sense, was actually cut off from the earlier literature produced in Arabic, which of course was preserved by the Ismailis of Syria who used Arabic. But of course, we do know that, for instance, these Arabic books of the Fatimid times were available in the library at Alamut. And Tusi, who worked there for a long time, we have evidence that he did see some of these earlier Arabic texts and used them, in his own work. Yes? No?
Convert to Ismailis if you, in marriages.
You don't have to do anything, no? No. You can convert if you like to, but you are not obliged to.
There is an ask. Rita Hay was married.
Yes, yeah.
I want to know if she converted.
I don't know. Unfortunately, I wasn't there at the time, but otherwise, I will let you know. It's not. It's not forced. Actually, throughout history, throughout their history, with the exception of the very sort of first phase, the opening phase, the Ismailis were never interested in mass conversion or in forced conversion. Never. Yes.
How did you, as an economist, become interested?
Oh, that's the $50 million question. I have reserved my answer for a later date. Yes.
So what is the difference between Ismailis and Shias in terms of Khums?
Ismailis are Shias. You have to be very precise. You have to say what's the difference between Ismaili, let's say Shias, and Zaydi Shias, or Isna Ashari Shias. What's the question?
The 12 Imams,
Okay.
what the dominant Ismailis
All right.
What are the differences in terms of their zakat and khums types, of...
No, I mean the payments are
is that the same kind of rules that...
more or less, yes. Names are not always the same, but the essence is the same. There are donations to the religious leadership of the community, to the supreme religious leader of the community, who is a person of the imam of the time.
The calculate is pretty much the same.
There are slight sort of differences. Numbers are not, exactly the same. Yes.
How much knowledge do you have of the Ismailis from China? And you mentioned they were converted by Khusro.
Nasser Khusro.
So I'm interested in the language because you have...
The Ismailis of that region in, Xinjiang now, they so ethnically regard themselves as Tajiks. And they speak Uyghur, Turkish. Their literature is pretty much the same as the literature of their neighboring Badakhshani Ismailis. So to our knowledge, which is not much because only in recent times we have found access to that region and to that community, they do not seem to have elaborated a specific local tradition of their own. They are really they followed more or less the same traditions and rituals and sort of literary traditions as the Ismailis of Badakhshan.
Time for one more question.
One more question. The last question. Yes.
Well, you mentioned again, I'll go back to this revolutionary thoughts. I'm very interested in that of the Ismailis from the beginning, and you mentioned that the quietism of Imam Sadeh, his father was also very scholar, as you know, Muhammad Baqir
Yes.
was also into that and wasn't quote-unquote revolutionary in
No.
today's sense, like Imam Hussein, for example.
No.
However, the Zaydis, which were the fifth Imam, they were supposed to be very
Activists in terms of their policy from the beginning, but not in terms of their teachings.
I see. But yeah, so that's why I wanted to understand why didn't the Ismailis, or not, I mean, the first people who were the adherent of Ismailis, why didn't they go with the ideas of Zaydis? I mean, if they were into this...
Because the earliest Ismailis, they split from the Imami Shia, So they had inherited the heritage and the traditions of the Imami Shia, which had been already set from the time of Imam al-Baqir specifically.
I see. So they believed in that
Yeah.
lineage. Right?
Yes, yes, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.